Hey there, I'm Jim Rohn, and today I'm going to tell you a story that doesn't involve yelling, tears, or drama, but it will shatter the ego of someone who runs from intimacy. If you've ever loved someone who kept their walls up, who made you feel like you were too much, but somehow you couldn't let go, this video is for you. Because here's the truth no one tells you. Sometimes you don't need to scream to be heard. You just need to go silent and walk away with your dignity intact. In today's video, I'll reveal 7 signs that a deeply empathetic person, a so-called super empath, is quietly dismantling an avoidant partner's ego, not with rage, but with calm, grounded detachment. This isn't about mind games. This is raw emotional truth, how someone who was once taken for granted finally stands up, draws the line, and refuses to keep begging for crumbs of affection. I'm not here to sell you fairy tales about love. I'm here to help you see this clearly. If someone requires you to sacrifice your peace just to feel close, that's not connection, that's control. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to hear might just change how you see love, pain, and most importantly, yourself. Subscribe to the channel if you're ready to walk away from what's been making you feel small. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is leave in silence. 1. Don't explode, but be silent. Not everyone recognizes the exact moment someone truly lets go, because sometimes it doesn't arrive with a loud fight or a dramatic exit. Sometimes it comes in complete stillness when the person who used to check in every day suddenly vanishes from your screen. No more, "Are you okay?" No more, "We need to talk." Just silence. But don't mistake that silence for coldness, it's not. It's the signal of someone who's finally too tired, too clear-eyed, and who has finally chosen themselves over a relationship that was built on one-sided effort. And that moment when presence turns into absence becomes the loudest declaration. I'm no longer fighting for something that isn't fighting for me. For the avoidant, who's used to controlling connection through push-pull dynamics, this withdrawal is a blow they never saw coming. Because they never planned for the possibility that the empath wouldn't beg, wouldn't explain, wouldn't wait anymore. They'd just walk away softly, but permanently. If you're the empath, I know you've probably tried to make sense of the distance. You blamed yourself. You thought, maybe I need to be more patient, or maybe I'm just too sensitive. But eventually, your heart wakes up to this truth. You were never too much, they were too closed. And you no longer need to prove you're worthy. You no longer stay to fix someone who keeps hurting you while refusing to face themselves. This silence isn't rebellion, it's clarity. It's the realization that continuing to explain your feelings to someone who refuses to understand is a betrayal of yourself. And you stop. Not because you've stopped loving them, but because you've started loving yourself more. I've seen this transformation in people who used to stay up all night, wondering why a text went unanswered. Now, they wake up in peace, realizing that silence is the only response left when every word has gone ignored. And that's when real healing begins. You don't need closure. You don't need anyone to end the story for you, because you walked out with the strength of someone no longer held hostage by emotional lack, but led by self-respect. And now the avoidant feels the void, because the energy that held the dynamic together is no longer there. They lived in control but never prepared for loss. They assumed you'd always come back, that you needed them to feel whole, but they were wrong. You didn't need them. You needed you. And when you go silent, it's not because you have nothing left to say, it's because no one left deserves to hear it. This isn't cruelty, it's your awakening. 2. No need for validation from avoidant. And then, following that silence, something even deeper begins to unfold. The empath no longer seeks validation from the avoidant. This shift doesn't arrive with fanfare, it creeps in slowly, like a veil finally lifting after years of emotional fog. Where once they waited on a kind word, a timely hug, or a simple text that said, "You matter to me," the empath now realizes those weren't signs of love. They were crumbs, just enough to keep them hoping, never enough to feel held. Something inside starts to move, a quiet force, fullness. Not because they're getting more from their partner, but because they've started giving themselves what they used to wait for. They stand in front of the mirror and stop asking, "Am I lovable?" and instead ask, "Do I love who I am in this relationship?" That one question, gentle yet powerful, marks the beginning of self-validation. What unnerves the avoidant isn't rage or blame. It's the sudden disappearance of the empath's need for approval. Avoidants often depend on one thing to feel valuable: being pursued. But now, those eyes no longer search for them. They've turned inward toward the empath who once bled themselves dry for love and has now learned to stand whole. This is quiet strength, undeniable in its depth. The empath stops trying to earn points, stops shrinking for comfort, stops craving the breadcrumb. And what emerges is something the avoidant never expected: self-possession, a grounded sense of wholeness. And that empties the avoidant of the power they once held. Make no mistake, letting go of needing validation doesn't mean you stop feeling. It means you've learned that real love is not a prize for pain. You no longer love in hopes of being loved back. You love because that's who you are, even if it means loving yourself enough to walk away. When you stop asking, "Do they love me?" and start asking, "Do I love how I feel around them?" the entire game changes. You're no longer waiting to be chosen. You are doing the choosing. And that shift terrifies those who depended on your emotional dependence to feel secure. The truth is, no one should live trying to prove they're worthy of being loved. You are not a performance. You are a person, a whole, feeling, deserving human being. And when you stop looking to them for your worth, that's when you dismantle the structure they used to keep you small. You don't need to be picked. You just need to pick yourself. And when you do, the avoidant is left with only the echo of control they once held, now crumbled under the weight of your quiet, sovereign choice. No more approval needed. No more proof. Just presence, self-respect, and the strength to leave. 3. Expressing inner indifference. And then, from that silence and self-respect, the empath enters an entirely new internal space, one where they no longer react. The desperation is gone. The emotional reactivity has dissolved. No more scrambling to fix it. No more bending to keep the peace. Instead, what takes root is a quiet indifference. Not coldness, but an unshakable calm. A letting go that begins within, where every storm once brewed, and now there is still water. This is the moment the avoidance emotional games begin to lose their grip, because their power was never about direct control. It was built on your reaction. When they withdrew, you chased. When they went cold, you tried harder. When they withheld affection, you offered more. But now, you do nothing. You no longer fill in the gaps. You no longer write the long texts. You no longer fight for clarity. You just stop. And to the avoidant, that's more terrifying than any argument. Because what scares them most isn't your outrage, it's your lack of reaction. Your inner silence doesn't punish, it simply exists. And in that space, they realize something has changed. They no longer control your emotions. They no longer dictate the tempo of the connection. The dance they choreographed falls apart because you're no longer moving to their rhythm. And you, once tormented by silence, sleepless from the ambiguity, now sit still inside it, not wondering what they're thinking, but realizing you no longer care to figure it out. This is not passive aggression. This is maturity. This is what it looks like when someone stops betraying themselves to protect a bond that harms them. Your indifference doesn't mean you don't feel. It means you've learned not to abandon yourself for someone who disappears whenever you express a need. It means you've stopped investing in someone who punishes vulnerability. And now, instead of trying to change them, you change yourself. You step back. The avoidant may feel the void not because you begged them to stay, but because you didn't. And in that silence, for the first time, they're forced to face their own emptiness. You were the emotional scaffold, the emotional interpreter, the one who held it together. But now, you're no longer playing that role. And that quiet internal stance, no accusations, no explanations, becomes the sharpest mirror of all. It doesn't shout, "You need to change." It simply says, "I won't carry your emotions for you anymore." And in its quiet, their emotional architecture begins to crack. You don't have to say a word. You just stop doing. No more pleading, no more chasing, no more hoping. Just you, grounded, undisturbed, choosing peace over chaos. And that grounded energy shakes everything they thought was stable. Because now, you're not reacting, you're choosing. And that choice, quiet but firm, is what dismantles the illusion of control they once believed in. 4. Set boundaries and stick to them. And then, From that silence and firm emotional stillness comes an irreversible shift. The empath sets a boundary, and this time, they actually hold it. No more, "If you keep doing this, I'll have to walk away," followed by texts the next day checking in. No more boundaries born out of anger, only to dissolve in a moment of loneliness. Because now, the boundary is not a threat. It's not leverage, it's self-respect. And that changes everything. This isn't control. This isn't manipulation. This is a life statement. I know what I need, and I'm willing to walk away if it's not here. Avoidants are used to people withdrawing boundaries when it gets cold. They rely on your guilt, your fear of loss, to maintain power. But this time is different. This time, the empath doesn't set the boundary to change them. They set it to protect themselves. The boundary isn't reactive or fueled by pain. It's grounded, clear, and immovable. It doesn't scream. It whispers to the self, "I deserve more than this." And when the avoidant realizes that the boundary isn't a test, it's a line that will not be crossed, they begin to lose their grip. To an avoidant, real boundaries are terrifying because they end the gray area. No more half intimacy, half avoidant. No more 1 foot in, 1 foot out. A real boundary draws a line. You're either fully present or not present at all. And they've never been ready for that because that demands emotional responsibility they've spent their lives dodging. But here's the thing, the empath no longer cares whether they're ready. They're not waiting anymore. The boundary is no longer a last-ditch effort to save the connection. It's the gate that guards their self-worth. It doesn't say, "Change for me." It says, "If this is who you are, then this was over long ago, I've just finally caught up." Oh, the beauty of a true boundary is that it doesn't beg to be noticed. It doesn't need validation. It stands because you know your soul can't afford to keep bleeding for someone who won't show up. And when you hold that boundary, no apologies, no panic, no backpedaling. The avoidant has nothing left to pull you back with, because you're not standing in reach anymore. That quiet steadiness is what collapses their emotional control system. There's nothing left to provoke, no more bait, no more game. Just you standing behind a boundary, not angry, not inviting, but full of strength. And in that light, they are forced to face what they've long denied. If they don't change, they will lose you not in a fight, but in the silence of a door that no longer opens. 5. Mirror the other person's behavior. And after the empath has embraced silence, stood their ground, and held clear boundaries, they enter one of the most profound stages of transformation. They begin to mirror the avoidant's behavior, but not out of revenge, not to play games, not to get even, simply because they've stopped contorting themselves to preserve a connection built on imbalance. Because they're no longer willing to carry the full emotional weight alone, what they once received is now gently reflected back. In the past, the avoidant would leave messages on read, disappear for days, then reappear as if nothing happened. Speak in half-truths or with emotional distance, leaving the empath spiraling, "Did I do something wrong?" But now, the empath no longer adjusts themselves to keep the peace. They start behaving in alignment with what they're receiving. A one-word reply, they respond the same. The avoidant disappears, they don't chase. The avoidant grows cold, they stop trying to warm the room. This isn't retaliation, it's clarity. If this is the energy you bring, this is the energy I'll return. And suddenly, the avoidant who once believed their emotional detachment was power, who relied on silence as a shield, begins to feel that same silence from the other side. They send a message, and there's no reply. They initiate, and receive nothing back. They wait to feel desired, and no one is reaching for them. Not because the empath is trying to hurt them, but because the empath has finally learned. No one deserves more from you than they're willing to give. Mirroring isn't a tactic. It's a natural consequence of emotional self-respect. When you stop over-functioning, you begin to treat others the way they've treated you, not to hurt them. But as a reflection, the mirror doesn't scream. It doesn't accuse. But it shows the avoidant exactly what they've been doing in a way words never could. And that's what hurts. Not because the empath intends harm, but because, for the first time, the avoidant isn't protected from the consequences of their own behavior. The empath who once managed all the emotions in the relationship has stepped back, and the avoidant is now left to sit in the emotional vacancy they once created. The irony is that avoidants often believe distance keeps them safe, but when they have to live in that same distance without someone chasing them through it, it no longer feels like safety. It feels like emptiness, because they were never prepared to inhabit the space, only to create it. Now, with silence on both sides, the avoidant is finally forced to feel what they've always avoided: their own emotion. 6. Indifference becomes self-esteem, and from that place of mirroring, a final, powerful transformation begins to unfold, one that is subtle, but absolutely life-altering. What once looked like indifference now becomes self-respect. This time, indifference isn't a mask. It's not a survival mode. It is peace earned, grounded, and fully integrated. The empath no longer sees pulling away as betrayal. They no longer wrestle with guilt for stepping back. They've come to understand, walking away isn't abandonment. It's self-protection. This new indifference isn't detached numbness, it's conscious choice. It comes after the pain, the exhaustion, the longing, and finally, the awakening. The realization that love isn't about winning, it's about being safe within it. And when a relationship becomes a battlefield of uncertainty, this quiet detachment, once born of trauma, now becomes the boundary of emotional sovereignty. It says, "I no longer let my emotions be dictated by inconsistency." It says, "I feel, but I don't deplete myself." That's what self-respect sounds like, still loving, but no longer self-sacrificing in the name of love. The avoidant might not understand this shift at first. They might think, "She must have forgotten me," but the truth runs deeper. She's remembered herself. She's remembered what it's like to laugh freely, sleep peacefully, and feel whole before she got pulled into the spiral of a connection that only offered confusion. And now, she's returning to that wholeness, not to prove anything, but because she no longer needs someone to feel valuable again. This kind of indifference isn't cold. It's soft. It doesn't sting. It simply refuses to remain where growth is impossible. It says, "I don't need you to understand. I don't need closure. I don't need you to change." All it needs is for the empath to keep walking with peace, not pain. And the most powerful part? They no longer hope for anything from the one who once hurt them because their center has shifted back to themselves. This is when distance no longer feels like loss. It becomes space for rebirth. Each step away doesn't make them colder, it makes them clearer. Each silent choice not to react, not to chase, not to seek understanding, nourishes their self-worth. A self-worth that no longer hinges on external validation, least of all from someone who once made them feel like too much. And it's in that peace, when distance is no longer agony, but sovereignty, that the avoidant finally sees this is not the same person. The empath no longer needs them to feel complete. And that realization that you're thriving without them is what shakes their walls the most. Not because you wanted to hurt them, but because you stopped hurting yourself to keep them close. Now you're not just surviving, you're rising in a way they can no longer reach. 7. Sublimate when alone. And finally, when silence has held, boundaries have been honored, behaviors mirrored, and detachment transformed into self-respect, the most beautiful, profound, and yes, final shift occurs. The empath begins to thrive alone, no longer haunted by, will they come back? No longer checking their phone each morning for a sign of acknowledgement. Instead, there are slow mornings with coffee, peaceful evenings without emotional chaos, genuine laughter that needs no approval. The empath who once sacrificed emotional stability just to maintain connection now rebuilds a life where they are the center. No more decoding silence, no more living on emotional crumbs. They live. They love themselves. They walk with wholeness. And this is the moment the avoidant's ego collapses. Because deep down, the avoidant never truly believed the empath could live without them. They mistook emotional dependence for power. They believed their silence held gravity, that it made them important. But now, no one's reaching back. No one's knocking. No one's waiting. Your absence is no longer strategy, it's sovereignty. And that shatters a self-image built on control. The avoidant hasn't lost someone who needed them. They've lost someone who once chose them and now chooses themselves. That's the most powerful shift of all. When the empath begins to thrive, they don't fake happiness to prove a point. They are happy. They don't post joy to get a reaction. They live it with no audience required. That's the kind of healing that makes manipulation irrelevant. You don't need the avoidant to see you thriving because you no longer seek their gaze. And so, the avoidant who once believed they controlled the narrative is left with the echo of themselves. No tearful pleas, no desperate texts, no open doors. Just stillness and the realization they lost someone who loved them deeply, simply because they never showed up to love back. Thriving isn't about winning the breakup. Thriving is when you come home to yourself with no need for vengeance, no need for blame. You don't need someone to be wrong for you to feel right. You only need clarity, and you found it inside. You start dreaming again, laughing again, building real connections, not to fill a void, but to share your wholeness. You are no longer waiting to be loved. You are love. No validation needed, no explanation owed. You chose yourself, and there is nothing more powerful than that. And so, the journey from the empath who once lived in anxiety and sacrifice to the one who stands in clarity, wholeness, and peace doesn't begin with changing others. It begins with remembering yourself. No longer the one who chases, who pleads, who holds the relationship together, but the one who knows their worth, who says no without guilt, and who walks away not out of hatred, but out of loyalty to their soul. This journey isn't easy. It takes a courage deeper than any outburst, the courage to be still, to stop, to not react. But it's in that silence that you hear your truest voice. In that indifference, you rediscover your dignity. In those boundaries, you reclaim your worth. And in solitude, you find a kind of freedom that no one else can give you and no one can take away. If you once believed that real love means never giving up, remember this. Real love doesn't mean staying no matter the cost. It means not abandoning yourself in the name of it. If someone makes you constantly doubt your worth, constantly feel like you're too much, they are not love. They are the mirror showing you how far you've drifted from your own center. But now, you've come home. You no longer need to be chosen because you've chosen you. You don't need to shout to be heard because your silence now speaks everything. You don't need a pretty ending because you are the new beginning. If this message resonated with you, know that you are not alone. There is an entire community awakening just like you. Subscribe to the channel to keep walking this path back to your peace, your power, your self-worth. Because sometimes, the strongest thing you can ever do is walk away with dignity, in silence.